Just be still, Erica whispers, her voice barely audible over the ringing in her ears. She stares into the cracked mirror of the service corridor, pressing a damp cloth to her cheek. She isn't just trying to stop the bleeding, she's trying to stop the evidence of her failure. In this world, the world of high-stakes diamonds and cold blood, vulnerability is a scent that attracts sharks, and Erica has worked too hard to climb out of the gutter to let 17 entitled monsters drag her back down. She thinks of her sister's tuition, the apartment she finally secured, and the reputation for unshakable composure she spent a decade building. If the board sees her like this, battered, trembling, human, the promotion is gone, and without that promotion, her walls come crumbling down. She dabs at the corner of her mouth, but the split lip is stubborn. Then the heavy steel door groans open. Erica freezes. An apology is already on her tongue, a practiced professional mask, but the air in the room suddenly feels heavy, pressurized. Castro stands in the doorway. He isn't just a client, he is the Castro, a man whose presence feels like a physical weight. Mid-30s, his custom-tailored suit straining against shoulders built for more than just boardroom meetings. His tattoos creeping up his neck tell the story of a man who hasn't just seen violence, he's mastered it. His eyes aren't angry, they are worse. They are calculating. He doesn't move, he doesn't offer a handkerchief. He simply watches her with a controlled intensity that makes her lungs hitch. The security cameras in the south lot went dark for 10 minutes tonight. His voice is a low, dangerous rumble that vibrates in the small space. He steps into the light, the ink on his hands dark against the sterile white walls. He reaches out, his thumb catching her chin, with a gentleness that feels more terrifying than a threat. He tilts her face toward the light, his gaze tracing the bruises. The silence is deafening. Finally, he speaks the words that change everything. "Who did this to you, Erica?" Castro's presence didn't just fill the doorway, it seemed to consume the very oxygen in the service corridor. He stood motionless, a towering silhouette of tailored obsidian in jagged ink. The flickering overhead light caught the sharp edge of his jaw and the dark, intricate patterns of tattoos that climbed his neck like vines reclaiming a ruin. Erica's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, as she instinctively tried to turn her face away, to hide the blooming purple shadow on her cheek and the drying blood on her lip. I was just leaving, Mr. Castro," she stammered, her voice thin and brittle. She tried to sidestep him, her heels clicking unevenly on the linoleum, but he didn't budge. He was a monolith of controlled violence, his gray eyes, the color of a North Atlantic gale, tracing the wreckage of her face with a terrifying clinical focus. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Erica felt the heat of his body radiating toward her, a stark contrast to the cold sweat chilling her spine. She had spent years navigating the egos of the city's elite, but Castro was different. He didn't play by the rules of polite society. He was the man who wrote the footnotes in blood. He raised a hand, and for a split second, Erica flinched, her eyes fluttering shut. She expected the sting of a blow or the rough grip of a man who took what he wanted. Instead, she felt the ghost of a touch, the calloused pad of his thumb grazing the edge of her jaw. It was impossibly light, yet it held the weight of an anchor. "Look at me, Erica," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a low, resonant vibration that settled deep in her marrow. Slowly, she forced her eyes open. Up close, the intensity of his gaze was staggering. There was no pity there. Castro didn't do pity. But there was a simmering volcanic pressure that suggested a storm was breaking somewhere far out at sea. He saw everything, the torn lace of her sleeve, the way her hands wouldn't stop shaking, the defiant glint of a woman who refused to break even when she was shattered. "You're trembling," he noted, his voice dropping an octave, becoming something intimate and lethal. His thumb moved again, tracing the line of her bruised lip with a possessive, agonizing slowness. Is it because of me, or is it because of what they did? Erica swallowed hard, the scent of his expensive tobacco and cold rain enveloping her senses. It doesn't matter. I have a job to do. I can handle this. You can't even stand straight, he countered, his eyes darkening until the pupils swallowed the gray. He stepped further into her space, forcing her back against the cold brick wall. He loomed over her, a shadow so vast it felt like protection and peril all at once. The men who did this think they are gods. They think the shadows of this city belong to them. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear, sending a different kind of shiver down her spine. They're wrong. The shadows belong to me. The air in the narrow corridor felt as though it were being sucked out by a vacuum, replaced only by the heavy scent of Castro's expensive wood smoke cologne and the cold metallic tang of the blood still weeping from Erica's lip. He didn't pull away. His thumb remained anchored on her jaw, a possessive weight that forced her to maintain eye contact with the storm brewing in his pupils. "The parking garage," he murmured, his voice a low melodic threat. The security feeds were white, but the concrete doesn't forget, and neither do I. Erica tried to swallow, but her throat felt like it was filled with glass. "Castro, please, they're influential. If this gets out, if the board thinks I'm a liability—" "The board," he interrupted, his lip curling in a brief predatory sneer. "You're worried about men in silk ties while you're bleeding out in a service hallway. I don't care about the board, Erica. I care about the fact that someone thought they could touch what I've been watching for 4 years." His hand shifted, his finger splaying across her cheek, his palm cupping the bruise with an agonizing, impossible tenderness. The contrast was dizzying, the rough, tattooed skin of a killer against her own battered face. It was the first time in her life she felt she didn't have to be the strongest person in the room. "I need them," Castro said, his voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the very walls to listen. "Every single one. Not just the one who swung the fist, the ones who watched, the ones who laughed, the ones who stood by the cars and did nothing while you screamed." Erica's breath hitched. She hadn't told him she screamed. She hadn't told anyone. There were so many of them. They were drunk. They thought it was a game. "It's a game they're about to lose," he replied, his gray eyes darkening until they were nearly black. He leaned in closer, his forehead almost touching hers, grounding her in his shadow. "Give me the names, Erica. All 17 of them. If you don't know the names, give me the faces. Give me the car models. Give me the way they smelled." She looked at him, seeing the monster the world whispered about, and for the first time, she saw him as her own private sanctuary. The fear that had been paralyzing her for the last hour began to transmute into something else, a cold, sharp desire for the justice the law would never give her. "Tyler Delano was the first," she whispered, the words shaking as they left her lips. Castro's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He didn't look surprised, he looked hungry. "That's one. 16 more, Erica. Don't leave a single soul out. By dawn, I want the world to forget they ever existed." One by one, the names began to fall from her lips like lead weights, and with every syllable, Castro's grip on the world outside that room tightened, preparing to crush it for her. The list was complete, 17 names, some spoken with a shudder, others with a flat, hollow finality, now hung in the stagnant air of the corridor like a death warrant. Castro didn't write them down. A man like him didn't need ink to remember a debt of blood. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, though the air around him seemed to crackle with an invisible, gathering storm. Seeing her smallness against the brick, the way her shoulders hitched as the adrenaline finally began to leach out of her system, Castro reached for the buttons of his suit jacket. With a fluid, practiced motion, he shed the outer layer of his armor. He stepped into her personal space, his shadow falling over her like a heavy velvet curtain, and draped the lapels tight against her chest. The scent of him rushed in to fill her senses, a sophisticated blend of expensive sandalwood, aged tobacco, and something sharper, something metallic that spoke of cold steel in dark alleys. It was the scent of power, unyielding and absolute. For the first time since the parking garage, the primal, bone-deep shivering in her limbs began to subside. "You stay here," Castro murmured, his voice low and vibrating against the crown of her head. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand hovering near her throat, before his fingers settled gently over the silk of the jacket he'd just given her. He adjusted the collar, shielding the bruises on her neck from view. "My driver is waiting at the service entrance. He will take you to my private residence. Not your apartment, not the office. Mine." Erica looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. "And you?" Castro's gaze drifted toward the door, his eyes turned to flint. The gentleness he had shown her didn't disappear, but it was eclipsed by a cold, predatory focus that made her realize just how much of a monster he really was. He wasn't just a protector, he was a reckoning. "I have 17 errands to run," he said softly. The promise in his tone was more terrifying than any shout could have been. It was the sound of a man who had already decided the future. "By the time the sun hits the glass of this building, the men who touched you will be a memory that the city is too afraid to keep." He leaned down, pressing a lingering, proprietary kiss to her forehead, a mark of his protection that felt as permanent as the ink on his skin. When he pulled away, the warmth went with him, but the jacket remained, wrapped around her like a suit of mail. She watched him walk away, his white shirt gleaming in the dim light, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms built for the violence he was about to unleash. The city didn't notice when the tide turned, but in the dark veins of the North End, the air grew heavy with the scent of an approaching slaughter. While Erica was whisked away in a car with blacked-out windows, Castro stood on the rain-slicked pavement and pulled a burner phone from his pocket. He didn't dial a number. He sent a single, encrypted file. 17 faces, 17 locations, one directive: erase. The clock struck midnight, and the machinery of the Hawthorne underworld roared to life with the silent efficiency of a guillotine. In a high-end penthouse overlooking the harbor, Tyler Delano was mid-laugh, a glass of crystal amber in his hand, when his front door was kicked off its hinges. He didn't have time to drop the glass before 3 men in charcoal suits, shadows given form, descended upon him. There were no demands for money, no negotiation. There was only the cold, hard realization in Tyler's eyes that his father's name couldn't protect him from the man whose jacket Erica was currently wearing. Across the city, the 17 were being harvested like wheat. At an underground poker club, a man was dragged from the table into the alleyway, his screams muffled by the roar of a passing subway train. In a luxury high-rise, another was intercepted in the elevator. The doors opened on the lobby 3 minutes later to find nothing but a spilled espresso and a lingering silence. Castro's men moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, cutting through the city's elite social circles like a scalpel through silk. Castro himself watched the first of the extractions from the shadows of a black SUV. He didn't need to get his hands dirty yet, but he stayed close enough to feel the vibration of the hunt. Every time a confirmation text chimed on his phone, he felt a jagged piece of his own restraint snap. This wasn't business. It wasn't about territory or respect. It was about the way Erica's voice had hitched when she said the 10th name. It was about the blood he had wiped from her lip. By 2 a.m., the local precincts received anonymous tips that led them on wild goose chases toward the outskirts of town, leaving the city center a playground for Castro's retribution. The men who had treated the parking garage like a coliseum were now the ones being hunted, realizing too late that they had struck a queen protected by a king who didn't believe in mercy. The underbelly of Boston was screaming, but it was a scream caught in a throat, silent, suffocating, and absolute. The tally was dropping. 12 gone. 14. The night was still young, and Castro's appetite for justice was nowhere near sated. The sun crept over the Boston skyline, a pale, clinical gold that failed to warm the frost on the windows of Castro's estate. Erica stirred in a bed that felt like an ocean of silk, the weight of the previous night pressing down on her chest like a physical hand. For a terrifying second, she expected to feel the cold concrete of the parking garage or the sharp sting of salt on her split lip. Instead, there was only the scent of sandalwood and the heavy, protective stillness of a fortress. She sat up, Castro's suit jacket still draped over the chair beside her, a discarded skin of the man who had become her shadow. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It wasn't a text from her boss or a notification of her termination. It was an automated alert from the hospital's billing department. She stared at the screen, her breath hitching in her throat. Her sister's outstanding balance, the six-figure weight that had kept Erica in a state of perpetual, desperate motion, read 0. Paid in full. No names, no receipts, just the silent, absolute erasure of her greatest fear. Erica walked to the window, pulling a plush robe tight around her. Below, the city was waking up, but it was a different city than the one she had walked through yesterday. She turned on the television, the volume low. The news anchor's voice was strained, professional composure cracking, as she reported an unprecedented series of disappearances across the city's most elite zip codes. 17 men, from CEOs' sons to trust fund heirs, they had all vanished between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m. No ransom notes had been left, no signs of struggle remained in the sterile penthouses and gated estates. To the world, it was a mystery. To Erica, it was a symphony. The door to the bedroom opened with a soft, heavy click. Castro stood there, the morning light catching the tattoos on his hands. He looked as though he hadn't slept a wink, yet he carried no exhaustion, only a dark, satisfied calm. He didn't ask if she had seen the news. He didn't mention the money. He simply walked toward her, his eyes scanning her face to see if the bruises had faded. "The world is quiet today," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to settle the remaining tremors in her hands. Erica looked at him, truly looked at him, seeing the monster who had spent the night burning down the lives of 17 men just to ensure she could breathe again. She realized then that the silence wasn't just the absence of her attackers, it was the peace of being claimed by something far more dangerous than anything she had ever feared. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was his, and for the first time in her life, the future didn't look like a struggle, it looked like a throne. The tea Castro placed on the bedside table remained untouched, its steam curling into the quiet air like a ghost. Erica watched him through the mirror as he paced the room with the restless, prowling energy of a predator that had finished the hunt but hadn't yet calmed the bloodlust. He had shed his tie, the top buttons of his shirt undone to reveal the dark ink spanning his collarbones, making him look less like a billionaire and more like the king of shadows she now knew him to be. "Why?" she asked, her voice finally steady. "The hospital bills, the disappearances. You could have lost your standing with the board. You could have brought the police to your door. This wasn't professional, Castro. It wasn't even logical." Castro stopped his pacing. He turned to her, his storm gray eyes narrowing as he closed the distance between them. He didn't stop until he was standing directly over her chair, his presence a heavy, warm pressure that demanded her full attention. "You think I did this for the company?" he asked, a low, dark chuckle vibrating in his chest. "You think I care about the optics of an event coordinator getting hurt?" He leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of her chair, effectively pinning her in place. The intensity in his gaze was enough to make her heart skip. "I haven't just noticed you, Erica. I've cataloged you," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "I watched you navigate rooms full of sharks without ever letting them see you bleed. I watched you sacrifice your sleep, your health, and your youth to keep your sister alive. For 4 years, I stayed in the periphery because I wanted to see if you would come to me on your own. But when I saw you in that corridor, broken because of those subhuman cowards," his jaw tightened, a flash of that midnight violence returning to his expression. "The logic died. The employer died. I didn't care about the board or the police. I only cared about the fact that they touched what belongs to me." "I don't belong to anyone," she countered, though her voice lacked its usual bite. Don't you? Castro's hand moved, his fingers tracing the line of her throat, where the bruises were already beginning to fade. You wore my jacket. You used my name to erase your debts. You slept in my bed while I cleared the streets of your enemies. He leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. This wasn't a business transaction, Erica. It was an awakening. I've spent 4 years wanting you. Now I'm keeping you. The heavy silence of the bedroom was only broken by the rhythmic ticking of a clock that felt like a countdown to a life Erica had never imagined. She walked away from Castro, crossing to the large floor-to-ceiling window. Below, the city was moving, oblivious to the fact that its hierarchy had been decapitated overnight. 17 men were gone, their legacies erased by the man currently watching her with the stillness of a gargoyle.
You're asking me to accept a life built on ghosts, Erica said, her voice a low vibration against the glass. She looked at her reflection. The bruise on her cheek was a dark, ugly reminder of the world's cruelty, but the silk robe she wore was a reminder of the price of his protection. I spent my whole life trying to follow the rules, Castro. I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I stayed professional enough, the world would be fair. And then 17 men proved me wrong in 10 minutes. The world is never fair. Castro's voice drifted from behind her. He hadn't moved, yet his presence felt as if it were wrapping around her. It is only ruled. You can be ruled by men like Tyler Delano, who use their power to break things because they're bored, or you can be protected by a man who uses his power to ensure no one ever looks at you the wrong way again. Erica turned to face him. At what cost? You committed 17 felonies before breakfast for me. You paid a debt that wasn't yours. If I stay, if I take what you're offering, I'm not just an event coordinator anymore. I'm a part of this. I'm the woman standing beside the monster. Castro stepped into the light, the morning sun glinting off the gold watch on his tattooed wrist. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't try to soften the reality of who he was. I am a monster, Erica. I have blood on my hands that will never wash off, but that blood is the reason you're safe today. That blood is the reason your sister will live to see her graduation. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, waiting for her to close the gap. The choice isn't between good and evil. It's between being a victim or being mine. Erica looked at his hand, large, scarred, and capable of such terrifying precision. She thought of the cold fear in the parking garage and the warm, absolute safety of his jacket. She realized that she wasn't afraid of his violence. She was addicted to the security it provided. She wasn't choosing a criminal. She was choosing the only man who had ever truly seen her. Slowly, she stepped forward and placed her hand in his. The moment her skin touched his, the air seemed to settle. The shiver that had lived in her bones for years finally went quiet. I don't want to be a victim anymore, she whispered. Castro's grip tightened, firm and possessive. Then you never will be again. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a sea of shimmering silk and forced smiles, a place where the city's elite gathered to pretend the world hadn't shifted on its axis 48 hours ago. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and hushed, frantic whispers about the missing 17, but the room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence when the heavy oak doors swung open. Castro didn't just enter, he took possession of the space. He looked every bit the dark prince of the Boston underworld, his tuxedo impeccably tailored to hide the lethal power beneath, though his tattoos on his hands remained a stark, defiant reminder of his true nature. But it wasn't his presence that stole the breath from the room. It was the woman on his arm. Erica moved with a grace that felt like a challenge. She wore a gown of midnight velvet that clung to her curves like a second skin, the high collar artfully concealing the last remnants of the bruises on her neck. Her face, once hidden in the shadows of a service corridor, was now held high, her expression a mask of cool, diamond-hard composure. As they moved through the crowd, the sea of socialites parted as if fearing his very shadow. Castro didn't lead her, he moved with her, his hand splayed possessively against the small of her back, his thumb tracing a slow, deliberate rhythm that told the world exactly who she belonged to. They were intercepted by Marcus Delano, Tyler's father, whose face was a ghostly mask of grief and suppressed rage. "Castro," he hissed, his voice trembling. "My son! The others! People are talking." Castro stopped. He didn't let go of Erica. Instead, he pulled her slightly closer, his body heat a physical barrier between her and the grieving man. He looked down at Marcus with eyes that held the cold, eternal stillness of a grave. "People should be careful what they talk about, Marcus," Castro said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to carry to every corner of the silent room. He reached out with his free hand, adjusting Erica's diamond earring with a tenderness that was more threatening than a raised fist. "And they should be even more careful about what they touch." He turned his gaze to the room at large, his eyes locking onto every man who had ever looked at Erica as if she were merely the help. "Erica is no longer an employee of the Hawthorne estate. She is mine, and from this moment forward, any hand raised against her is a hand I will take. Any word whispered in her direction is a debt I will collect in blood." The public claim wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a declaration of war. Erica felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to hide. She looked up at the monster beside her and leaned into his strength, realizing that in a world full of predators, there was no safer place than by the side of the apex. The gala continued behind them, a muffled symphony of clinking crystal and hollow laughter, but on the secluded balcony, the air was sharp and real. The winter wind whipped at the edges of Erica's velvet gown, yet she didn't feel the cold. She couldn't, not with Castro standing behind her, his heat radiating through the heavy fabric of his shirt as he wrapped his arms around her waist. He tucked his chin into the curve of her shoulder, his tattoos dark against the moonlight, his presence a living wall between her and the world that had tried to break her. "They're terrified," she whispered, looking out over the city lights that glittered like fallen diamonds. "They look at us and see a ghost and a killer." Castro's grip tightened, not out of aggression, but a fierce, grounding possessiveness. "Let them look. Fear is the only language this city respects. It's the only thing that ensures you'll never have to hide in a service corridor again." He turned her in his arms, his thumb tracing the faint, fading line of the bruise on her jaw, the only physical evidence left of the night that had changed everything. "Does it bother you, being the woman at the center of the storm?" Erica looked into his eyes, seeing the storm-gray depth that once terrified her. She realized then that she wasn't just a survivor of the violence, she was a participant in the retribution. She had given him the names, she had watched him erase them, and in the dark, quiet corners of her soul, she felt no guilt, only a crystalline, terrifying peace. "I think," she said, her voice dropping to a low, raw resonance that mirrored his own, "that I was always a monster, Castro. I just didn't have the teeth to bite back until I met you. I spent years suppressing the rage, smiling while they looked through me, playing the perfect professional while I was screaming inside." She reached up, her fingers tracing the ink on his neck, her touch light yet fearless. "You didn't turn me into this. You just gave me a reason to stop pretending." A slow, predatory smile ghosted across Castro's lips. It was a look of recognition, the moment one apex predator finally sees its equal. He didn't want a damsel, he wanted a queen who could walk through the fire he set. "Then we burn together," he murmured, his breath ghosting over her lips. He leaned down, and the kiss was an explosion of raw intensity, a sealing of a dark covenant. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't kind. It was a promise of a life lived in the shadows of power, protected by blood, and bound by a love that the rest of the world would never understand. As the moon hung high over Boston, Erica Claire Winters finally stopped running. She was safe, not because the danger had passed, but because she was finally standing in the heart of the fire.